Thank you, Jake. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real honour and a real thrill to be here, a part of the first Belfast International Ballet Festival. Yes, as Jake was explaining, I am a ballet historian, and I am the founder of a project called the Marius Petipa Society, which has been promoting the legacy of the legendary choreographer Marius Petipa, without whom ballet wouldn't be what it is now. And I'm really, really happy and thrilled to be here to present to you the history of Swan Lake. So let's get started. So, Swan Lake is perhaps the most famous and one of the most popular ballets of all time, and it's the one ballet that everyone always thinks about whenever they hear the word ballet. But what's the history behind this most beloved ballet? Do we all know Swan Lake as well as we think we do? Well, we're going to have a look at where it all started, up to what we tend to know from the present day. I will be taking you a bit through the history, and then we're going to have a look at two significant changes that have been made to the ballet. So can we have the first slide, please, Ian? Okay. So the story of Swan Lake began in the summer of 1871 in the village of Kamenka in Ukraine, where Tchaikovsky's sister Alexandra lived with her family, and Tchaikovsky, pictured here, was a regular guest there. And the story goes that one day, when Tchaikovsky was out for a walk in the Ukrainian countryside, he came across a flock of swans on a lake or a pond, and something about the beautiful image made something in his creative genius click. And it prompted him to compose a little house ballet for his nieces and nephews called The Lake of Swans. And according to his nephew, Yuri Davidov, or Bob, as Tchaikovsky called him, this was when Tchaikovsky composed the famous theme from Swan Lake, which Bob called the Song of the Swans. 4 years later, Tchaikovsky was working in Moscow, and he was commissioned by, forgive me if I'm not saying this correctly, Vladimir Begedchev, a ranking official of the Imperial Bolshoi Theatre, to compose his first ballet for the Moscow repertoire. And Tchaikovsky was very excited by the commission because he was an avid ballet fan. When trying to decide the subject matter for the new ballet, he had considered Cinderella, but that never happened. And then he clearly turned back to the little house ballet he had composed 4 years prior, and he decided to expand and immortalize it into a full-length work. Next slide, please. And here we have a sketch of the second act of the original production. So for the subject matter for Swan Lake, Tchaikovsky was inspired by European legends about swan maidens, supernatural maidens who can turn into birds, into swans, and who are mostly found in German mythology. It's believed that he was also inspired by the operas of one of his favorite composers, Richard Wagner, particularly Der Ring and Lohengrin, the latter of which tells of the legendary Swan Night. Now, Tchaikovsky composed the score between early 1875 and April 76, and the choreographer of the original production was a man called Julius Reichinger, ballet master of the Imperial Bolshoi Theatre. However, Tchaikovsky did not experience such a good collaboration with Reichinger because it seems that he worked with very vague instructions for the score when what he needed were very detailed instructions from Reichinger, because the composer needs detailed instructions for what kind of dances and music numbers the choreographer needs. The original libretto for Swan Lake has been credited to Begedchev, and it was quite different from the story we know today because it followed the stories of the romantic ballets of the early 19th century about a supernatural maiden and a mortal man who fall in love, but all ends in tragedy. A brief synopsis of the original libretto. During a hunting expedition, Prince Siegfried discovers an enchanted lake deep in the forest where a group of swan maidens lives, and he is enamored with their leader, Odette. Odette and her friends fly as swans during the day and resume their human forms at night by the lake, but she is being stalked by her evil stepmother, an evil witch who assumes the form of an enormous owl and wants to destroy Odette. Only the magic crown Odette wears that was given to her by her grandfather protects her. Siegfried swears his love, which can save Odette from her stepmother, but he then falls for the seductive charms of the beautiful Odile, the daughter of the demon von Rothbart, who is in cahoots with the stepmother, and all is lost. Odette refuses to forgive Siegfried for his betrayal and prepares to leave, but he tears off her crown and throws it into the lake, which leaves them at the mercy of the evil stepmother, who causes the waters of the lake to overflow and engulf them. Happy story. Swan Lake made its world premiere on the 4th of March, Old Style 20th of February, 1877, at the Imperial Bolshoi Theatre in Moscow. It is widely believed that the world premiere was a failure, but that wasn't the case after all. Reaction to the ballet was at best lukewarm. The criticism it received was mostly directed at Reisinger's choreography, the dancers, and elements of the production, and there was criticism of Tchaikovsky's score, which some deemed too noisy, too symphonic, too Wagnerian, and too complicated for ballet. But there were some who saw the ballet's potential. I think it was really Tchaikovsky himself who deemed the ballet a failure because he was known for being very sensitive and self-critical, and he didn't get the reaction that he had wanted. But nevertheless, Swan Lake remained in the Moscow repertoire for another 6 years, and this was mostly thanks to Reisinger's successor, Joseph Hansen. Hansen staged several revivals of Swan Lake in which he made significant changes with the additions of new dances, changing the outline of the ballet, and he even used a happy ending. Hansen's stagings proved more successful than Reisinger's, and they kept Swan Lake in the repertoire until it was finally dropped in 1883 after Hansen's departure from Moscow. But of course, that wasn't the end. Next slide, please. 3 years later, Ivan Seveloshky, pictured here, director of the St. Petersburg Imperial Theatres, approached Tchaikovsky and expressed interest in reviving one act of Swan Lake for the 1886-87 season in St. Petersburg. Although this was never materialized, Seveloshky continued to show interest in reviving Swan Lake, but before that, several discussions for a new ballet in 1888, Seveloshky commissioned Tchaikovsky to compose The Sleeping Beauty, which would mark the composer's first collaboration with Marius Petipa. Petipa and Tchaikovsky developed a great working relationship, with Petipa giving Tchaikovsky very detailed instructions on what he needed for the music score. The Sleeping Beauty was very successful, and Petipa and Tchaikovsky would collaborate again in 1892 on The Nutcracker, although Petipa later had to withdraw as choreographer due to illness and was replaced by his second ballet master, Lev Ivanov. Now, eventually, it was decided that Petipa would mount a full revival of Swan Lake, and Tchaikovsky was delighted at the prospect of his first ballet being restaged by Petipa, for whom he had the greatest of respect, saying, and I quote, "Never with anyone else would I produce ballets." Sadly, Tchaikovsky would never live to see the production produced by Petipa because he died on the 6th of November, Old Style 25th of October, 1893, just when plans for the production were coming into fruition. Next slide, please. And here we have, on the left, we have Petipa, and we have Ivanov on the right. So in the aftermath of Tchaikovsky's death, work on Swan Lake continued, and it was supervised by Tchaikovsky's brother Modeste, who now held the rights to his brother's works. Modeste also took charge of changing the story, omitting the complexities of the original story, and simplifying it into the fairy tale that we're all familiar with today. We all know the story. The young princess Odette is under the spell of an evil genie who turns her into a swan by day and allows her to resume her human form only at night, and she's forced to live by an enchanted lake that was formed by her mother's tears. When Prince Siegfried discovers the lake, he falls in love with Odette, and there is hope for the spell to be broken. But Siegfried is tricked into declaring his love for the evil genie's daughter, Odile, magically disguised as Odette, and all seems lost. However, Odette chooses to die rather than live forever as a swan and leaps into the lake. Siegfried follows her, the spell is broken, the evil genie is destroyed, and the ballet ends with an apotheosis in which Siegfried and Odette spirit off together into the afterlife. The principal conductor of the Imperial Theatre Orchestra, Riccardo Dorigo, was tasked with revising the score after receiving approval from Modeste. Some numbers were cut, the order of some that were kept were rearranged, and 3 pieces from Tchaikovsky's Opus 72 for piano, which Dorigo arranged and orchestrated, were interpolated into the score. These 3 pieces became the variation of Odile in Act 2, the Waltz of the White and Black Swans, and the Pas d'Action in Act 3. And which all replaced Tchaikovsky's original dances of the swans in the final act. It was also decided that Petipa and Ivanov would collaborate on the choreography, and they split the ballet between them. Petipa choreographed Act 1, Scene 1 and Act 2, and Ivanov choreographed Act 1, Scene 2 and Act 3, the lakeside acts. Next slide, please. Cast in the dual role of Odette and Odile was the Italian prima ballerina assoluta Pierina Legnani, pictured here on the left, and cast as Prince Siegfried was the Imperial Theatre's premier danseur noble, Pavel Gert, pictured here on the right. Fun fact, Gert was 50 years old at the time and was, unsurprisingly, no longer dancing. Despite this, he was still playing some heroic and principal roles. How it worked was he would perform all the mime, and they would bring in a younger dancer to do all the dancing. Yeah. The first time an excerpt of Petipa and Ivanov's Swan Lake was shown to the public was on the 17th and 22nd of February, 1894, at a Tchaikovsky memorial concert that was arranged by Sevelushki and included some of Tchaikovsky's works, including Act 1, Scene 2 of Swan Lake, with Legnani as Odette and Gert as Prince Siegfried. The Petipa and Ivanov Swan Lake premiered on the 27th of January, Old Style 15th of January, 1895 at the Imperial Mariinsky Theatre, and the reaction was mixed, but better than the 1877 production. 2 key reasons for the better reaction were Petipa and Ivanov's choreography and Legnani's performance as Odette and Odile, and the role became one of her signature roles. And Swan Lake remained in the St. Petersburg repertoire, and eventually it was introduced to the rest of the world. And through the course of the 20th century, the ballet was staged worldwide and gained huge popularity. Next slide, please. And here we have 2 more historical photos. On the left, we've got Anna Pavlova as Odette and Nikolai Lagat on a tour to Berlin in 1909. And then we have on the right, we have Tamara Karsavina as Odile and Samuel Andrianov as Prince Siegfried around 1918, I believe, in St. Petersburg. So throughout the 20th century, like all of Petipa's ballets, Swan Lake was staged all over the world in countless revivals, and went through many changes to the point where there were many differences between the productions staged here in the West and those staged in post-revolution Russia. The Western productions, especially the British productions, were more faithful to Petipa, but in Russia, the changes were more drastic. They omitted the mime, and mime scenes became purely danced numbers. Characters that were originally purely mimed roles became danced roles. Elements of some of the stories were changed, and Petipa's choreography was changed. The steps, the musicality, the style, etc. Many changes were made to Swan Lake. For example, the character Benno, who is Prince Siegfried's best friend, often present in Western productions. In Russia, he was omitted and was replaced with a court jester who was introduced by the ballet master Alexander Gorsky in his Moscow productions. And the evil genie, better known today as von Rotbart, but he's actually only called von Rotbart in Act 2 when he's in disguise. He was transformed into a purely mimed role, from a purely mimed role into a danced role in the Russian productions. And eventually some of these changes found their way into some Western productions. Next slide, please. But in 2016, the closest version to Petipa and Ivanov's version was staged by world-renowned choreographer Alexei Ratmansky for the Zurich Ballet in Switzerland, using a collection of notation scores called the Sergeyev collection, which contains Petipa's surviving choreography that was notated in the late 19th and early 20th century. Ratmansky reconstructed what has survived of Petipa and Ivanov's Swan Lake. He later staged the production for La Scala Ballet in Milan, and then 2 years ago he staged it for Miami City Ballet, pictured here. So here we have Don Atkins-Hilly as Odette, Stanislav Oleshansky as Prince Siegfried, and Damien Zamorano as Benno. So Ratmansky's production shed much light on how much had been changed, and as mentioned before, many changes were made, and I've already mentioned some. But I would like to talk about the history of one of the pieces that will be danced in the performance, and that is what is now known as the Black Swan pas de deux. Next slide, please. And here we have it from a modern production. We've got Polina Semyonova as Odile. So this pas de deux has quite a complex history. It was originally composed by Tchaikovsky for Act 1 as a pas de deux for two merrymakers, but Petipa transferred it to Act 2 as the grand pas of Odile and Prince Siegfried, because Tchaikovsky did not originally compose a pas de deux for the second act. Instead, he composed a pas de six, which we think was performed by Odile and other candidates for Siegfried's Bride. Although after the premiere, Tchaikovsky did later compose and interpolate a pas de deux for the second act at the request of the prima ballerina Anna Sobeshanskaya. And the music for that pas de deux is famous today for being the music of George Balanchine's Tchaikovsky pas de deux. So when Petipa transferred the original Act 1 pas de deux to Act 2, it had to undergo some changes. Drago was tasked with revising the music because, as Tchaikovsky had composed it, one movement would transition into the other. There was no perfect cadence or ending for each of the movements except for the coda. Drago edited the ending of the adage so that it ended on a perfect cadence. He cut the original allegro ending for solo violin, although that piece was later revived in the 1940s and became the traditional variation for Prince Siegfried, but Petipa used the original tempo de valse piece for Siegfried's variation. But again, Drago had to edit the ending. And I mentioned before that Drago arranged and orchestrated one of Tchaikovsky's pieces for his Opus 72 for piano, three pieces, one of which became the variation of Odile, which is the traditional one that's still danced today. Petipa choreographed this pas not as a pas de deux, but as a pas de quatre demi d'action, meaning 4 people originally took part, and there was action as well as dance. The 4 roles were Odile, Prince Siegfried, von Rothbart, as he's known in Act 2, and an additional cavalier who danced Prince Siegfried's variation because Pavel Gert was unable to do so. So the piece is actually a grand pas d'action rather than a grand pas de deux. Now today, it's known as the Black Swan pas de deux, but it was never staged under any such title by Petipa, and there's a reason why. Right, what I want you to do is I want you to take a look at the slide. This, as I said, this is the very traditional, typical portrayal of Odile that we all know today. Black costume, swan arms, swan poses, Odile the Black Swan. Now in some productions, she's magically disguised as Odette, and in others, she's Odette's evil double. There's a big difference between how she's portrayed today and how she was portrayed under Petipa. So what I want you to do is look at this photo for a few seconds. Keep this image in your mind as we move on to the next slide. Please. Okay. Now, on the left, we have the 1895 costume design for Odile. This is the design for Legnani's Odile costume. And on the right, we have another image from Ratmansky's production again, Don Atkins-Hilly as Odile and Stanislav Oleshansky as Prince Siegfried. Now, look at these 2 images. Think about what you saw in the previous slide, and I'm going to actually ask you a question here. Don't be scared. Can anybody tell me what is different between what you're seeing here and what you saw on the previous slide? What are you seeing here that you don't normally see in Swan Lake? Hands up if you can tell me. You can get it. Sorry? Correct. Well done, Liam. Yes, the color. The costumes are colored. They're not black. And yes, there is a reason why. In 1895 and 1877, Odile was not a black swan. In 1877, she was a femme fatale seductress, and in 1895, she was an evil enchantress. In both versions, she was the evil genie's evil daughter, but only in 1895 was she magically disguised as Odette. As you can see here, Pierina Legnani did not wear a black costume, nor would Odile wear a black costume for many years. In the earliest post-revolution productions, the Russian ballerina Olga Spasivtseva wore a red costume, and in one of the earliest American productions that was staged for San Francisco Ballet, the American ballerina Janet Reed wore yellow. So the first time Odile appeared as a black swan was in a 1920 production staged at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow by Vladimir Nemirovich Danchenko. And eventually the idea spread, and every Russian production started to portray Odile as the black swan. In the West, it started later, much later, after a 1941 production that was staged at the Met in New York, in which the ballerina Tamara Tomanova wore a black costume. And this seems to have set the tradition in motion in the West and the rest of the world. Now, in Petipa staging, Odile is magically disguised as Odette, but she doesn't perform any swan movements because she's not trying to imitate Odette's movements like in modern productions. What happens is that during the adage, she approaches her father several times and he whispers to her, giving her instructions on what to do. And this is still used in some productions today. And then when the vision of Odette appears at the window, Odile covers Siegfried's eyes. In Petipa staging, she covers his eyes so that he doesn't see Odette. And I should also point out that this swan portrayal was also the case with Odette. In modern productions, Odette is often portrayed as some sort of a half-woman, half-bird creature because she's always performing swan poses and swan arms, but she's only supposed to do that when she's in her swan form, not when she's in her human form, and for at least two reasons. She doesn't have wings when she's human, so there's no logic to her pretending that she does. And these are the few hours of every day she gets to be her true self. So why pretend she's still a swan? Now, it is possible that Ivanov used swan arms, but if he did, I don't think they would have been as they are now, because I think they would have been softer. And over time, especially in Russia, the swan arms became more and more exaggerated, and I believe it was Agrippina Vaganova who first exaggerated them. My guess would be that the way Margot Fonteyn did them probably would have been more similar to what was done in the late 19th, early 20th century. And of course, the most famous feature of the Grand Pas d'Action is the 32 fouettes en tournant. And these were part of the original choreography. They were Legnani's tour de force. Now, it must be understood, Legnani was not the first ever to do a fouette sequence. Rather, she introduced the magic 32 number. She did them in her native Milan and in London, and she was the first to do them in Russia in 1893 when she debuted at the Imperial Theatre in Ivanov and Enrico Cicchetti's Cinderella. She performed the 32 fouettes in the final act, and it caused an absolute sensation. In fact, the audience was so thrilled that they made her do them again. She had to repeat them, yeah. Second time round, she managed 28. But even more impressive, eyewitness accounts say that when she did all 32, she did them without stopping and without moving from the spot in which she started. So for Swan Lake, Petipa decided to use Legnani's trick again, and the whole purpose of the 32 fouettes is that this is the moment when Odile succeeds in enchanting Siegfried. She literally whips him under her spell, and of course they've been kept, and they're a very famous feature ever since. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the final slide. Here we have a very beautiful sketch drawing of the apotheosis from 1895. And the other significant change that I want to talk about just for a bit is the third act. The structure was changed by Petipa and Ivanov, and many productions today do their own versions. Many productions use Tchaikovsky's original music, but the majority of his Act 3 music was cut in 1895. His Dances of the Swans was replaced with another of his piano pieces called Valse Bleuette, as arranged and orchestrated by Drigo, and was added as a waltz for the Swan Maidens and a group of black swans. I've already explained Odile wasn't a black swan, but Petipa and Ivanov did use black swans in the final act. The purpose of them is that they represent the tragic fate that now awaits Odette. And the overriding reason why Petipa used black swans was because he didn't think it made sense for a ballet to have more than one white act. So he decided that the last act needed some color. He initially had the idea of using rose-colored swans. Obviously, he didn't use those. Instead, he went for black swans. And the black swans were mostly kept in Russian productions, but in most Western productions, they're absent. Yes. And the so-called storm music was also cut, and the third piano piece that Drigo added and used as a pas d'action, in which Odette and Prince Siegfried reconcile. Now, not many productions use these two interpolations. The most famous is probably Konstantin Sergeyev's production for the Mariinsky, but they're also used in several other productions. One other is Valery Kovtun's production for the National Opera of Ukraine, and the Valse Bleuette is also used in Balanchine's Swan Lake, and of course Ratmansky's production uses them. And then finally we have the ending. I don't think there's any other ballet in the repertoire where the ending has been changed so many times. Modern productions are known for using different endings. Some use tragic endings, others use happy endings. The happy ending was brought back, was introduced in the Soviet Union, and the reason why was political. It was because the Soviet government ordered for it to be changed, because in accordance with socialist realism's preference for a clear-cut victory of good over evil. Now, most Western productions kept the Petipa and Ivanov ending and/or did their own versions of it, but others introduced new endings. For example, Rudolf Nureyev's production. The finale, as Petipa and Ivanov staged it, mostly contains acting rather than dancing. I'm sure you all know. After Odette and Siegfried reconcile, the evil genie arrives and taunts them, reminding Siegfried of his broken vow, and that dawn is approaching, meaning that Odette has to soon take flight. But Odette has resorted to die rather than live as a swan forever without Siegfried, and leaps into the lake. Siegfried follows her. The spell is broken, the evil genie falls down dead, and the ballet closes with the apotheosis scene here, which I believe is actually a reference to the swan boat from Lohengrin. Yeah. So, as I wrap up, I would just like to say a huge thank you to Jake, to Anna, to Rana, and to Arrow for arranging this incredible ballet festival. And thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of it. It is a real honor. And thank you all very much for being a wonderful audience. And huge congratulations to all the dancers. Everyone has done such an incredible job. And I hope you all enjoy the show. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.